Good day, Grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Dito Magwala, and this program is brought to you by the Northern Cape Department of Education in collaboration with Pagama Research and Development. So in today's lesson, we are looking at the final part of human reproduction, and we are going to focus on the uterine cycle, fertilization, implantation, as well as gestation. So in our previous lesson, we looked at the ovarian cycle, right? So we looked at the changes that take place in the ovaries and the hormones that influence all of those changes. So now we are just going to look at the uterine cycle, and we're going to wrap up by just combining all these changes that happen in both the uterus as well as the ovaries. So we're going to just combine the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle. And then we will then look at what happens should fertilization take place and the process of implantation as well as the gestation period. So we are going to be looking at the events in the uterine cycle. So that is the changes that take place in the thickness of the endometrium. And then, like I said, we will look at fertilization, and we will look at the process that takes place after fertilization has taken place. And then we will look at the gestation period as well as the role of the placenta. So by the end of our lesson today, you should be able to describe the uterine cycle. You should also be able to describe the roles of the hormones that are involved in the uterine cycle. You should also be able to interpret graphs of the menstrual cycle. So if you are given any graphs regarding the menstrual cycle, you should be able to interpret those and understand which hormones are involved there. Right? You should also be able to describe the formation of a diploid zygote and development of the zygote into a blastocyst. So the process that takes place after fertilization. You should then also be able to describe the implantation of the embryo, and you should also be able to describe the gestation period as well as the function of the chorion and the chorionic villi. You should also be able to describe the function of the amnion, the amniotic cavity, and the amniotic fluid. You should also be able to describe the function of the umbilical cord, specifically the umbilical vein and artery. And lastly, you should also be able to describe the role of the placenta. So we are going to be looking at all these in this final lesson of human reproduction. Pre-knowledge would be the circulatory system as well as the female reproductive system. So the circulatory system is involved here because we are going to be looking at the circulation of blood. Right, let's have a look at our baseline before we get into our lesson. So the first question says, name 2 female hormones secreted by the pituitary gland. So these are specifically secreted by the pituitary gland, and we have the luteinizing hormone as well as FSH. Right, and then which of these 2 hormones is responsible for the development of the follicle? When we spoke about FSH in the previous lesson, I did mention that the follicle stimulating hormone has a name that sounds like its function. Its function is to stimulate the development of the follicle. So the follicle stimulating hormone would be the one that is responsible for stimulating the development of the follicles. Question 3, give the function of the veins in the circulatory system. Right, so the veins in the circulatory system would normally transport oxygenated blood towards the heart, right? Okay, and then the last question, give the function of the arteries in the circulatory system. In grade 9, when we learned about the arteries and the veins, we learned that the arteries and the letter A would mean that the arteries transport blood away from the heart. So arteries away. So that is the best way for us to remember this. So the arteries transport deoxygenated blood away from the heart. Right. Okay, let's have a look at our terminology. The first one is the uterine cycle, which refers to the changes that occur in the walls of the uterus as it thickens until menstruation occurs. Endometrium, that is the lining of the uterus. Menstruation, this refers to the discharge of blood and other material from the lining of the uterus at intervals of about 1 month. Implantation, the process by which the developing embryo becomes attached to the endometrium wall of a uterine cycle. Okay, next one we have is blastocyst. This is a hollow ball of cells that is implanted in the uterus. Then we have pregnancy or gestation period. This refers to a period during which the embryo develops within the uterus until a baby is born. Fetus, name given to the embryo when it reaches 12 weeks. The chorion, it's the outmost membrane around the fetus. Amnion refers to the membrane found on the inside of the chorion. All right, so as I said, we are going to look at the uterine cycle, and from there we will just wrap up by looking at both the uterine and the ovarian cycle. We will not be focusing a lot on the ovarian cycle today though. Right, okay, so as we know, this are the uterine cycle refers to the changes that occur in the walls of the uterus as it thickens. So here we are looking at the wall of the uterus. This would be what the wall of the uterus looks like, right? So remember, the menstrual cycle starts from day 0 up to day 28. So normally on day 0, if a female is not pregnant, you would see that the thickness of the lining of the uterus is going to decrease, because that thickness is going to be shedding due to menstruation taking place. So menstruation takes place from day 0 until about day 7 of the menstrual cycle, right? And then from day 7, we are now going to see the uterine, the lining of the uterus thickening once more, right? In preparation for fertilization, should the new ovum become fertilized, right? So there we can see that it is starting to thicken once again. So should by the day 28 be no fertilization, the shedding will take place again. However, if fertilization takes place, this lining of the uterus will remain thickened. And as we can see, this is what we have seen as we were looking at the ovarian cycle in the previous lesson. So we are not going to focus on that right now. Right, okay. So let's just have a look at a continuation of what we discussed in the previous lesson. So in the previous lesson, we discussed ovulation, which takes place on day 14, right? So now, should fertilization happen, should this ovum be fertilized, the corpus luteum is going to continue producing progesterone, right? However, if fertilization does not take place, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate and it's going to stop producing this progesterone, as there is no pregnancy to maintain. Remember, progesterone maintains pregnancy, right? So the corpus luteum will secrete progesterone to maintain pregnancy. However, that is if the ovum has been fertilized, then the corpus luteum will continue to produce that progesterone, right? So this progesterone ensures that the ovum remains attached to the uterine wall. So it is a hormone that maintains pregnancy. So this tells us that should the corpus luteum fail to produce enough progesterone during pregnancy, that pregnancy might lead into a miscarriage, as the fertilized ovum or the zygote cannot remain attached to the wall of the uterus. So it makes sure that that attachment stays like that throughout the period of pregnancy, right? So that is why we can say that progesterone maintains pregnancy, right? So remember, this is only if fertilization has taken place. But remember, if fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum will degenerate or it will rupture. So now, if the corpus luteum has degenerated, it means that the progesterone secretion is going to stop. The progesterone levels are going to start dropping. Right, let's just quickly go back to the previous slide with the cycle. We would then expect that the progesterone levels would be low. Let's have a look at the progesterone. It is the purple hormone here. As we can see, during that period where menstruation is taking place, the progesterone levels are low, because this is a sign that there is no pregnancy to maintain. Remember, females only undergo menstruation if they are not pregnant. So because menstruation is taking place, it means that there's no pregnancy, therefore there is no progesterone to maintain pregnancy. So that is how you would actually interpret these graphs and try to get an understanding of the levels of hormones in these cycles, right? So if the progesterone secretion stops, it means that the lining of the endometrium is no longer maintained. The thickness is no longer maintained. Therefore, it is going to start to shed. When it starts to shed, then we can say that menstruation is taking place. Right. We know that when we talk about menstruation, we are talking about the discharge of the blood that takes place at least once a month. Right. So this process is something that would start occurring during puberty between the ages of 11 to 14. Remember, different individuals may experience this differently. They can experience it before the age of 11. Some experience it as early as 9 years old, and they can also experience it way after the age of 14 years, with some individuals experiencing this after the age of 21. So it really just depends on different individuals, right? And we know that this menstruation will take place 14 days after ovulation. So remember, we have day 0, whereby menstruation is taking place, right? And then we have day 14, whereby ovulation is taking place. And then we have day 28. Remember, immediately after day 28, because this is a 28-day cycle. Actually, let's just have a look at it in the form of a cycle, right? So this would be the cycle. And then let's say this is our day 0. This is our day 14. And day 28 will be somewhere there. So this means that immediately after day 28, we are back to day 0. And we know that at day 0, there's menstruation. At day 14, there is ovulation. So this statement says menstruation occurs 14 days after ovulation. So 14 days after ovulation would be around day 28, meaning that from day 0, again, that is 14 days after ovulation. Therefore, menstruation can take place, which is the first day of the menstrual cycle, right? So menstruation takes place 14 days after ovulation, and ovulation also takes place 14 days after the first day of the menstruation, right? So the new ovum is released 14 days after menstruation. The release of the new ovum would be the ovulation process, right? Now we know that once ovulation has taken place, it means that the possibility of fertilization has increased. Should there be a sperm cell available for fertilization, that ovum will be fertilized, and we can say that there is pregnancy. Right. Now, when a female stops menstruating at a certain age, some females would stop menstruating, which will mean that the ovaries no longer produce any ovum. If the ovaries no longer produce any ovum, it means that this female can no longer be able to fall pregnant, as there needs to be an ovum for fertilization to take place. So when this takes place, or when this happens, we say that the female has reached menopause. Right, and it takes place from the ages of 45 until 55. However, again, remember, different individuals can experience this at different ages. Right, now we know that the first day of the menstrual cycle is the day where menstruation takes place, the day where the bleeding will take place. Right, and we also know that this can take place for about 5 to 7 days, depending on individuals as well. And this menstrual bleed is also then called a period. Right, from day 0 to day 14 to day 7, that is where menstruation is taking place. Then from there, around day 13, day 14, we start to expect ovulation to take place. Right. Now, this ovum is going to be taken into the fallopian tubes. Remember, the fallopian tubes are the site of fertilization. The sperm cell will meet the ovum in the fallopian tubes, and fertilization will take place there. We are going to then talk about what happens after fertilization. So if we have a look at this graph over here, we can see what happens in the uterine cycle, and we can also see what happens in the ovarian cycle at the same time. Remember, when we started with the ovarian cycle, I did mention that these two cycles take place at the same time. However, for convenience and better understanding, we decided that we will split these and discuss them separately. However, we need to understand that these two things take place at the same time. So as menstruation takes place on day 1, as the menstrual bleed is taking place, whereby we can see that there are low levels of progesterone because there is no pregnancy. There are low levels of estrogen because there is no pregnancy to prepare for at this point, right? And we can also see that in the ovaries, that is where the follicles are starting to develop. Then we can also see with that increase in the FSH levels, right? The FSH has to increase in order to stimulate the development of the ovum. And then we can start to see the changes as the days progress, leading up to day 14, where ovulation is going to take place. We can see that as ovulation is taking place, there are also some changes in the uterine wall, right? The uterine wall is increasingly becoming thicker and thicker. Why is it becoming thicker and thicker? So that should this ovum that is going to be released become fertilized, the uterus is prepared for this pregnancy, is prepared for the implantation of that fertilized ovum, for that diploid zygote. Now, ovulation is stimulated by the luteinizing hormone, right? So it means that towards the days where ovulation is going to take place, we should expect to see the levels of the luteinizing hormone increasing, right? So we can see that the levels of the luteinizing hormone are actually very high at this point, right? Let's just have a look at that. Right, so we can see that the luteinizing hormone is increasing. It is the one that is indicated in yellow over there. We can see that. And then we can also see that the estrogen levels are also going to change. We can see as well an increase in the estrogen levels. Remember, as the Graafian follicle develops, right? As the Graafian follicle develops, it will also start to secrete estrogen. Why does it secrete estrogen? So that the estrogen starts to prepare the wall of the uterus. It starts to thicken the wall of the uterus in case pregnancy takes place. So the estrogen levels are also going to show an increase, and it will be very high during the day where ovulation takes place. Right, and then we are going to then see that once ovulation has taken place, we have the corpus luteum. What does the corpus luteum do now? The corpus luteum is going to start to secrete progesterone, right? So that the progesterone can maintain pregnancy. So we can see that the progesterone level is starting to increase after day 14. Right. However, we can see that towards day 28, it is going to drop, which is a sign that fertilization did not occur. Therefore, menstruation is going to take place. However, you are going to get other graphs whereby this will continue to thicken, or the thickness will be maintained, meaning you will not experience this drop that we are seeing here. That would be an indication to you as well that fertilization has taken place. Also, this line here, which represents progesterone, would continue to remain high. That would also be an indication that pregnancy has taken place or fertilization has actually taken place. Right, so just get an understanding of what happens with the hormones and how do these hormones affect the ovarian and the uterine cycle. Also remember, these changes also work together. So as there are some changes in the ovarian cycle, that also affects some of the things that are going to happen in the uterine cycle. Now, if you have a look at the blue line, which represents progesterone, right, you will see that as the progesterone levels increase, there is going to start to be a decrease in the FSH levels, right? We know that as progesterone is increasing, FSH should be decreased because high levels of progesterone inhibit the production of FSH. Why? Because if progesterone continues to be secreted, it's a sign of pregnancy. Now, what does FSH do? It stimulates new follicles, a new ovum, basically. Now, do we need a new ovum if the female is already pregnant. No, because we do not need fertilization to take place now, as it has already taken place. So if fertilization has taken place, the progesterone levels are going to inhibit FSH so that there will be no development of a new follicle. We do not need a new follicle if pregnancy has already taken place. Right, so let's just wrap up what I said now. So the ruptured Graafian follicle is converted into a corpus luteum, right? And the conversion is controlled by the luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone controls ovulation and conversion of Graafian follicle into corpus luteum, right? And then we know that the corpus luteum will secrete the progesterone, which will maintain pregnancy, right? Now, during this pregnancy period, whereby you are going to see high levels of the progesterone. The high levels of progesterone are going to inhibit the secretion of FSH, as I have said. Why is that? So that the FSH does not stimulate the development of a new follicle. We do not need a new follicle if the female is already pregnant. But remember, if fertilization has not occurred, there is no pregnancy. Therefore, no progesterone will be released. If there's low levels of progesterone, then we can expect the levels of FSH to start to increase, because now we need a new follicle. Therefore, FSH must come into play and start the development of the new follicle so that there can be another chance for fertilization to take place. Whereas the unfertilized ovum is going to be released through the vagina through that process of menstruation. Okay, let's have a look at an activity. It says here, study the diagram below, which shows the menstrual cycle and the influence of different hormones. So if we have a look at this, we can see that it represents what we just looked at now, whereby we are seeing what happens from day 0 all the way up to day 28. Right, we can see FSH, we can see LH, estrogen, as well as progesterone. The first question says, which is 13.1, says, on which day does ovulation take place? We know that ovulation takes place on day 14. You don't have to know this by analyzing the graph. You always have to know that ovulation takes place on day 14. Right. And then 13.2, it says, between which days does menstruation take place? So menstruation, remember, will take place from day 0 until day 7. Right. So you can answer this based on what you are looking at on the graph. Right, so takes place on day 14 or day 15. Day 15 can also be accepted, and menstruation takes place between day 0 to day 7. So it needs to be indicated like this because it says here between which days. So if it is between which days, you have to say from day 0 to day 7. You can also use the to day 7. So it shouldn't just say day 7. Right. State one function of the luteinizing hormone. So as we have said, the luteinizing hormone is responsible for stimulating ovulation, which causes the burst of the follicle, and it stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum, which is conversion of the Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum. All right. And then 13.4, describe the changes in the level of the luteinizing hormone shown in the graph. Right, let's have a look at the graph. So we can see that it is the dotted lines. From day 0 to day 12, there is low levels of the luteinizing hormone. From day 12 until day 14, there is that sharp increase in the luteinizing hormone levels, and then it starts to decrease after day 14 all the way to day 28. So if we ever look at this, we will see that throughout most of the days within the cycle, the levels of the luteinizing hormone are usually very low, because mainly the luteinizing hormone functions to stimulate ovulation on day 14 and convert the Graafian follicle into a corpus luteum, which is taking place around day 14 or day 15. Right, so the levels of the luteinizing hormone remain low up to day 12 or day 13, and it increases sharply up to day 14. And then immediately after day 14, it is going to decrease and it is going to remain low. Right, and then 13.5, describe the relationship between the level of estrogen and the endometrium from day 7 to day 14. Okay, so we look at the estrogen and we look at the endometrium. Before you even look at the graph, just have a general knowledge of what happens when the estrogen levels are increasing. What effect does the estrogen hormone have on the endometrium? We know that estrogen's function is to thicken the lining of the endometrium. Right, now when you are looking at the graph, what do you see? Right, let's have a look. So let's see again. It says from day 7 to day 14. So not just any day, but day 7 to day 14. So from here, our estrogen levels are increasing. Why? There is that development of the Graafian follicle, meaning that the Graafian follicle is starting to secrete estrogen, hence the levels of estrogen are increasing. So there is an increase of the estrogen hormone, and there is also an increase in the thickness of the endometrium. Why? Because estrogen functions to thicken the lining of the endometrium in preparation for pregnancy should fertilization take place. Right. So as the estrogen levels increase, the thickness of the endometrium also increases, because that is what the function of estrogen is. Right. 13.6. Explain why it is necessary for the level of progesterone in the blood to increase after ovulation. So we know that it is important for the progesterone levels to increase so that it can be able to maintain pregnancy should fertilization take place. Right. So maintain the increase of the thickness of the endometrium for greater chance of implantation. We need implantation to take place after fertilization has taken place. 13.7. Did fertilization take place in the 28-day cycle illustrated in the graph? So by looking at the graph, you should know whether fertilization has taken place or not. What can you look at? You can look at the progesterone levels. You can look at the thickness of the endometrium. So in this cycle that we are looking at, fertilization did not take place because the thickness is, the wall of the endometrium is shedding, the thickness is decreasing, and the progesterone levels are also decreasing to show that there is no need for progesterone to maintain pregnancy. Right, so the answer would be no, there is no fertilization. And then the next question says explain your answer. So as we have said, from the levels of progesterone we can see that they are dropping, and it means they are not maintaining pregnancy. And also you will see that the corpus luteum has started to degenerate. That is another thing that you can look at besides the thickness of the endometrium. So let's have a look at that. There it is. It's not as big as it was here. So it is starting to degenerate. Therefore, that is a sign that fertilization did not take place. All right, now let's have a look at the formation of a diploid zygote after fertilization has taken place. So remember, the ovum is produced in the ovaries, and then it is released into the fallopian tube on day 14, ovulation. So this ovum is going to now start moving towards the uterus inside the fallopian tubes, right? As it moves towards the uterus in the fallopian tubes, when sexual intercourse takes place, the sperm cells are going to swim up the uterus into the fallopian tubes in order to meet with an ovum for fertilization, if there has been an ovum that has been released at that time. Right. So when we talk about sexual intercourse, we can also refer to it as copulation. So should copulation take place, the sperm cells are going to be released into the vagina of the female, and they will swim up into the fallopian tubes for fertilization. All right. So now, what happens after fertilization has taken place? So the sperm cell, remember, it will penetrate the ovum and fertilization will take place. Now, this is where we can now say that we have what? A diploid zygote. We know about a diploid zygote from genetics and inheritance, right? So we know that we have, from meiosis, we know that we have the 2N zygote, which contains 46 chromosomes, 23 from the father and 23 from the mother. Right, so this diploid zygote is what we would see immediately after fertilization has taken place. We can see here there is fertilization. Now, immediately after fertilization has taken place, we can see that there is that diploid zygote. Now, Here we have 2 cells. These 2 cells have been produced by which process? By mitosis. So this diploid zygote is 1 cell, right? We call it a unicellular zygote because it's now 1 cell. It undergoes mitosis and then it produces 2 cells that are genetically identical, right? So from the formation of this diploid zygote, we are now going to start seeing a series of mitosis that is going to take place in order for the growth to continue taking place, right? As we've said, this zygote is diploid, meaning that it now contains 46 chromosomes, right, with the genetic material from both the mother and the father, right? The sperm from the father and the ovum from the mother. The zygote now divides by mitosis many times as it passes through the fallopian tubes. So it will continue to divide by mitosis as it passes through the fallopian tubes towards the uterus where it is going to attach, right? After the first few cycles of mitosis, it is going to form a ball of cells that is referred to as the morula. So from ovum to fertilization to that zygote, diploid zygote, then it divides by mitosis. Now we have 2 cells, from 2 cells to 4 cells. We can see that it is continuously moving towards the uterus as all of this is taking place, right? And then after 72 hours, then we have that ball of cells, which we refer to as the morula, right? Mitosis will take place further here, and now we are going to have a hollow ball of cells. You are able to physically see the difference between the morula and the blastocyst. The hollow ball of cells is called the blastocyst. The ball of cells is called the morula. We can see that the morula does not have this space in the center, which is why we just call it a ball of cells, whereas the blastocyst has that space, therefore it is hollow, therefore it is called a hollow ball of cells. So from the ovum being a diploid zygote, the 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, 8-cell stage, and then morula, from morula to blastocyst. And then this blastocyst will develop into an embryo. Then that is where it is going to now attach to the wall of the endometrium or the wall of the uterus. Now we can say that implantation of the blastocyst has taken place. The blastocyst will now implant to the wall of the uterus, right? So remember, for this implantation to take place, it means progesterone should have functioned to make sure that the implantation takes place, to make sure that the thickness of the endometrium is maintained, and this pregnancy is then going to be maintained as well, right? So we know that the uterine wall has to be thick, it has to be vascular and glandular in order for the implantation to take place. This has been ensured by the increased levels of estrogen, which is responsible for thickening the endometrium wall, right? So now it means that because fertilization has taken place, fertilization has occurred, the corpus luteum is going to continuously secrete progesterone. This progesterone will ensure that pregnancy is maintained by making sure that the embryo, which has now, we now call it an embryo, from zygote to morula to blastocyst to now being called an embryo, must remain attached to the wall of the endometrium through the functioning of the progesterone hormone, right? So now there is pregnancy, the female is pregnant, and we refer to that pregnancy period as a gestation period, right? So this pregnancy or this gestation period simply defines a period during which the embryo develops within the uterus until a baby is born, right? So let's have a look at that development from day 1 until the end of the gestation period. So after 14 days after fertilization, this embryo would still look like a big dot. So it would be very small. It would be about 1 centimeters in diameter. So it is actually really small at that point, right? And then we can start to see a few changes when we have a look at it after 4 weeks. So at 4 weeks old, which is basically a month, it is still very small. However, we are starting to see some changes, and it now starts to have the shape of a comma, and it has increased to about 5 millimeters in diameter. As we can see here, there is starting to show some differentiation. We can see the different parts. We can see the eyes, the umbilical cord, the lower limbs, and so on. So certain parts of the body are starting to develop, including the brain, which is within the head at this point. Right. Okay. And then we move on to 12 weeks. At 12 weeks, now it is starting to resemble a human being, meaning that now it is starting to have more features, more development, and we can now see that it is looking more like a human being, and it is about 75 millimeters in length with a small mass of only 30 grams. Right. And now at 12 weeks, we no longer refer to it as an embryo, but we refer to it as a fetus. So we started off with a zygote, morula, blastocyst, embryo, and now it is referred to as a fetus. Okay, let's have a look at another activity before we move on. A tubal ligation is a surgical procedure in which a woman's fallopian tubes are clamped and blocked. Mpume underwent this procedure to prevent pregnancy. After many years, Mpume decided to have children, but was advised that it was dangerous to reverse the tubal ligation. It was recommended that she try in vitro fertilization instead, which is also known as IVF. She was given hormone supplements before the IVF was performed. The diagram below is a representation of how the IVF procedure was done. So we can see that the sperm cell and the ovum were placed into a tube, and the morula now formed. So as the morula formed, it was then inserted into the uterus through the vagina, and that would be where it is now allowed to implant, meaning that the ovum was removed from the ovaries. Remember, if it is the tubal ligation has taken place, it means that this part is blocked. Therefore, the ovum is not able to move from the ovaries to the uterus. So it was surgically removed from the ovaries and fertilized in a lab setting, and then the fertilized ovum, which is now a morula, is inserted in here to bypass the blockage. So that is what would have happened, right? 2.3.1 says identify 2 hormones that were likely to be present in the hormone supplement given to Mpume. Okay, let's talk about the 4 hormones. The luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for ovulation. FSH, the development of the ovum. And then progesterone and estrogen, maintaining pregnancy. So if we look at these 4 hormones, we can see that the FSH and the LH are the hormones that are more likely to be present in the supplements that she was given, so that we can ensure that the ovum is released, ovulation has taken place, and the development of the follicle has taken place. So those are the 2 hormones that would have been in the supplement that Mpume was given in preparation. Remember, for the ovum to be present, those 2 hormones need to function. 2.3.2, why is it not necessary for the hormone supplement to contain progesterone? Right, so at this time, we need the luteinizing hormone to develop the corpus luteum, right? Remember, luteinizing hormone converts graphene follicle into the corpus luteum, which will then produce the progesterone. So there will be progesterone if there is enough LH. So somehow the presence of LH affects the presence of progesterone, right? So progesterone is also not needed for either the formation of the ova or the release of the ova. So before we can get to progesterone, we still need to make sure that the ova is present before we move on to maintaining the pregnancy, right? So the IVF needs to be successful first before pregnancy can be maintained. Right. And then 2.3.3, how does the tubal ligation prevent pregnancy? So as I said, by tying these tubes over here, it means that the ovum will not be able to meet with the sperm cell because there is that blockage. So it's either the sperm cell will not be able to reach the ovum, or the ovum will not be able to move from the fallopian tubes and meet the sperm cell in the fallopian tubes and move into the uterus for implantation. So fertilization will basically not take place. Right. So as a result of the blocked fallopian tubes, the sperm cannot reach the ovum and fertilization cannot take place. So we prevent fertilization in that way. 2.3.4, describe the events that take place after fertilization in the test tube until implantation occurs in the uterus. So remember, once fertilization takes place in the test tube, it means that we now have a zygote. This zygote will undergo mitosis. From being a zygote, undergoes mitosis into a ball of cells. This ball of cells is called the morula. The morula will continue dividing by mitosis until there is a hollow ball of cells. This hollow ball of cells is referred to as a blastocyst or a blastula, and then the blastula will form a chorionic villi, which we are going to look at just now, which will then attach to the endometrium. So the blastula attaches to the endometrium and we say that implantation has taken place. Right. 2.3.5, describe the negative feedback mechanism between FSH and progesterone as it would occur in Mpume's body during pregnancy. We know that if Mpume is pregnant, the progesterone levels would be high. There is going to be an increase in the progesterone levels. High levels of progesterone inhibit the secretion of FSH. So it means that whenever there's high levels of progesterone, there is definitely going to be low levels of FSH in order to prevent the development of a new follicle, right? High levels of progesterone will inhibit FSH so that no new follicle can develop. Last question, 2.3.6. When Mpume falls pregnant, what will happen to the corpus luteum and the endometrium? So the corpus luteum is going to continue to secrete progesterone, right? So it will remain large and it can possibly increase in size, and then the lining of the endometrium will become thicker and the thickness will be maintained. Right, now we are looking at the last part where we're going to be looking at the role of the placenta in basically maintaining this pregnancy as well. So once implantation has taken place, whereby the blastocyst has attached to the wall of the endometrium, we are going to see a development of two membranes. So that blastocyst that has attached to the endometrium will develop two membranes, right? So there's going to be two membranes around the blastocyst, right? So these are found around the embryo, right? And they are referred to as extra embryonic membranes. I think we've seen extra embryonic membranes when we looked at the amniotic egg as well, right? So those are the chorion and the amnion, right? Okay, let's just have a look at those. We can see that the chorion is on the outer part and the amnion is within the chorion, as we can see over here, and then the embryo is on the inside. Hence we say that they are extra embryonic membranes. So the chorion, which is the outermost membrane, is going to be responsible for the formation of the chorionic villi. As we can see, there is the chorionic villi over there, right? And then we are also going to see that the amnion, which is on the inside of that chorion, is going to now form the amniotic cavity. I think this is the same as what we have seen with the amniotic egg, right? So within that amniotic cavity, we are going to find things such as the amniotic fluid, right? So this amniotic fluid that we find in the amnion or in the amniotic cavity actually has a few important roles that it plays in order to protect that developing embryo, right? So the first thing is that it acts as a shock absorber. That amniotic fluid acts as a shock absorber. Now, imagine if you have placed something very fragile in a box, right? And it's just laying in that box. Should there be any rough movement around the box, it means that that thing that is within the box can easily make contact with the walls of the box and break, right? Same applies to this developing embryo now. It is fragile, it is small, so it needs to be protected. Now, if you place that in water, the fluid, the movement will be reduced. So it is not easy for the developing embryo to experience any hard movements. So this amniotic fluid then acts as a shock absorber, thus protecting the embryo from any type of mechanical injury, right? And it also keeps that developing fetus moist, so it prevents drying out of that developing fetus, and it maintains a temperature range with a very small change. So if the temperature increases too much, this will keep the temperature as low as possible. If the temperature decreases too much, it will keep the temperature as high as possible. So it keeps the developing embryo within a narrow change of temperature. Remember, we talk about homeostasis. So this is something that would need to take place there, whereby the temperature does not increase too much or decrease too much. It also allows free movement. There is better and easier movement within any liquid or fluid environment for this developing embryo. So those are the functions of the amniotic fluid for this developing embryo. Right now, as we have seen, the chorion has developed into a chorionic villi. So now the placenta is made up of that chorionic villi, as well as the tissue of the uterus, the tissues of the uterus in which the villi is going to be embedded, right? Which makes up the placenta, right? What does this placenta then do? It serves as attachment between the fetus and the mother, right? And it also allows for diffusion of dissolved food from the mother and oxygen from the mother as well to the fetus. So this is one of the ways in which the fetus is going to receive nutrients from the mother to itself, right? And then it also allows for diffusion of nitrogenous waste from the fetus. So as the fetus develops, certain processes will start to take place and waste products will need to be removed. Therefore, we look at, or we depend on, the placenta to make sure that the waste substances are removed from the developing fetus, right? So should this removal of nitrogenous waste not take place, it means that the accumulation of the waste product can be toxic to that developing embryo, which could lead to a miscarriage or problems with the development of the embryo. And then the placenta again allows for diffusion of carbon dioxide from the fetus to the mother. So just removal of another type of waste. And then it secretes its own progesterone after 12 weeks of pregnancy. Progesterone maintains pregnancy, so if the placenta keeps releasing more progesterone, it means that pregnancy will definitely be maintained. Right, so this placenta is attached to the embryo by means of the umbilical cord. So the chorionic villi has formed, and then it is going to attach to the wall of the uterus of the mother, and then there's going to be an umbilical cord that will move from the placenta to the developing embryo. So the umbilical cord will be this hollow rope-like shape that goes from the placenta to the developing embryo, and it is going to be that passage for movement of substances between the mother and the developing embryo, right? So this umbilical cord contains umbilical blood vessels that we are going to look at now. So we have the umbilical artery as well as the umbilical veins. Right, we just looked at the functions of the umbilical arteries and veins when we looked at the assessment that we did in the beginning, right? So the umbilical artery is going to carry deoxygenated blood with nitrogenous waste away from the fetus to the placenta. So this artery is going to be carrying the waste products. Everything that is waste from the developing embryo will move through the artery away from the developing embryo, meaning that it is very important to make sure that there are no toxins accumulating on the side of the developing embryo. Right, and then the umbilical vein will carry the blood that is rich in oxygenated blood, as well as food from the placenta, obviously from the mother to the placenta, and then now through the umbilical vein to the developing embryo to make sure that it is receiving the correct nutrients for proper development. Now, it means that if we do not have a vein, the umbilical vein, the developing embryo will be underdeveloped as it will not receive the nutrients and the oxygen. It could possibly die without all of these. And then if the umbilical artery is also damaged, it means that the waste is going to accumulate on the side of the developing embryo, which could also lead to problems in the development of that embryo. All right, let's have a look at activity 3. Right, so the diagram below represents a human fetus at 36 weeks of gestation. We know that the gestation period is about 40 weeks long, right? So here we can see there is the placenta. It means that it is attached to the wall of the uterus there, right? From the placenta there we can see the umbilical cord going to the developing embryo or the fetus at this stage. Remember, it is now referred to as a fetus. And then we can see the amniotic fluid, meaning that there is the amnion there. And then we would also then see that there is this development which was due to the chorion, right? The chorionic villi, which now has formed the placenta, right? And then it says identify part A. So part A, we can see that it is pointing as at the umbilical cord, right? So the umbilical cord from the placenta to the developing embryo. Name one substance carried through A which diffuses into the mother. So this goes to the mother from the developing embryo, and that can be the nitrogenous waste or carbon dioxide. Right, so carbon dioxide, the nitrogenous waste, urea, uric acid, any waste products that you can think of that is produced by the developing embryo will then go to the mother. 2.3.3, give two functions of the amniotic fluid. Right, so we have spoken about the fact that the amniotic fluid prevents mechanical shock as it acts as a shock absorber, right? It allows for free movement and development of the embryo. We've spoken about the fact that it allows for the temperature range to be maintained around that developing embryo, right? And then it also prevents dehydration, right? So provides a water medium for development and movement, and then protects from mechanical shock as it works as a shock absorber, prevents dehydration, and it protects the fetus from temperature changes. So it maintains the temperature around that fetus. 2.3.4, explain one way in which the placenta protects the fetus and in which it acts as an endocrine gland. Right, what do endocrine glands do? Usually they secrete hormones. So what hormone does the placenta secrete? It secretes progesterone, right? How does the placenta protect the fetus, right? So one other thing that the placenta does is that it works as a filter. So what that means is that it does not allow just anything from the mother's side to enter into the environment of the developing fetus. So it acts as a microfetus to prevent the entry of any pathogenic organisms, meaning that anything that can cause diseases is blocked by this placenta. And the fact that it is responsible for excretion. It receives all those waste products from the amniotic, from the umbilical cord, from the developing fetus, and releases these to the side of the mother. So it removes the waste products from the fetus to the mother. So that is how it protects this from the waste products or the toxins as well. Right, and then acts as an endocrine gland. As we have said, it is responsible for secreting hormones such as estrogen and progesterone directly into the blood. So there are no ducts. Remember, endocrine glands do not have ducts, unlike exocrine glands. Okay, our homework, it says study the diagram below of the sequence of events that take place from the fertilization of an ovum to the development of the embryo in a part of the human female reproductive system. The arrows indicate the direction of development of one ovum after fertilization. So you are going to look at this. We can see that here we have the ovum before fertilization, and we have just discussed what happens after fertilization until implantation takes place there. So you're going to study this and answer the questions provided, and the answers will be discussed in the next lesson. All right, just to summarize the process from fertilization to implantation, remember you would start with that ovum that is unfertilized, right? And then once one sperm manages to fertilize the ovum, now we have a fertilized ovum, which is a diploid zygote, a unicellular diploid zygote, which divides by mitosis. Remember, from zygote to the 2-cell stage, mitosis needs to take place. After mitosis has taken place in the 2-cell stage, it will take place again to form 4 cells. From 4 cells, we have 8 cells. As this is happening, it is due to mitosis. We have discussed this in the previous lessons. And then now we have the morula in the 16-cell stage, right? A ball of cells. The morula is the ball of cells. Development takes place, continues, dividing by mitosis until we have that hollow ball of cells, which is made up of about 70 to 100 cells. The morula is a ball of cells. The blastocyst or blastula is a hollow ball of cells. This hollow ball of cells is now the embryo, and it is going to now attach itself to the wall of the uterus. And we can now see that implantation has taken place. Right. And then from there, the gestation period has started. Pregnancy has started. And we are going to experience the growth from the first day until the 40-week process. So now here we are going to be seeing the functioning of the placenta, whereby the placenta is going to connect the developing fetus to the uterine wall of the mother. So it connects the fetus to the mother, right? Whereas the umbilical cord is going to conduct substances from the fetus to the mother and from the mother to the fetus. Remember, the placenta also protects the developing fetus from waste products from the mother and by releasing them from the fetus to the mother, right? And then placenta allows nutrients to be taken in and gaseous exchange to also take place, right? Whereas the umbilical cord will link that placenta to the fetus, and it is going to also move the nutrients between the placenta and the fetus, as well as the waste products from the fetus to the placenta. And lastly, the umbilical cord is part of the fetus, whereas the placenta is part of the fetus as well as the mother. So there is going to be the part that belongs to the mother and the part that belongs to the fetus. All right. So in our next lesson, we are now going to start looking at a revision of our prelim papers. So now we are going to start preparing for our prelim examinations, as we are not too far from our exams, right? So here we are going to start by looking at paper 1. We're going to go through a paper 1 question paper. Specifically in the next lesson, we are going to look at the Eastern Cape paper, 2021 Eastern Cape question paper. We're just going to go through that paper together. We're going to look at ways in which we can better tackle the questions that we come across in that paper. And from there, we will look at the paper 2 Eastern Cape paper as well. And then from there, we will have a look at a few other papers from different provinces. And then in that way, we will be ready for our prelim examinations. Okay, we have come to the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.